This demo will walk through modeling in the admin console and illustrate how easy it is to construct complex models with IT Discovery Machine. The original modeling demo, if you watched it, shows something similar through simple web forms with a thin client. It wrapped the API calls with a Python twisted Flask Jinja framework. We could have done it with PHP and Apache or IIS or some other technology, but this demo will show it through our admin console. We still recommend forms be exposed to your current user-facing tools, but there are plenty of alternatives. Model metadata is a descriptor. As you see on a screen here, we're looking at inserting model metadata, and the metadata is a descriptor or blueprint for a model, and it tells the system how to map a discoverable object down at the bottom up to that logical object, and in this case it's the application, creating a context-rich model with those layers in between. And the number of tiers or layers in between is dependent on what you want your model to look like. This version is the one that we've most used. Discoverable objects at the bottom. This is a pattern, as you'll see that most of these are. This is a pattern. We're not just picking specific instances of objects that come in. So if new objects come in tomorrow or sometime in the future, they're automatically grabbed and modeled if they match, if they match the metadata. Since explanations are easier with pictures, I'll show a couple views before walking through the creation of a new model. And just as a side note, try not to focus on the visualizer or the GUI look and feel. Remember, this isn't the consumer front end, this is just the admin console, providing the necessary functionality when not instrumented through your front end tools. And I'll choose a couple of these, database management and the V2, to illustrate how the model can look different based on how you layer your metadata. Now remember the metadata layers, we had application at the top, and then there was the environment, logical group, location, logical object, and that discoverable object underneath. And so in this case, our group infrastructure isn't specific to the database type at the bottom. But if I switch over to Database Management V2, you'll notice that all the same discoverable objects are there, but we've just qualified a different layer in the middle. So here you see that based on the type, in this case it's Postgres, Platform, SQL Server, Vertica, MariaDB, that only that type is modeled underneath of it. So then to flip back between the form and the view, again we have discoverable object that we're mapping up to the application with environment, logical group, location, and logical object being defined in the view. And by defining that, it creates this model that you can see as a picture here or as different views of the raw data in the other part of the console. Now that I've talked about the metadata and shown how it looks in a model, let's walk through the creation of a new model. And since this is a lab instance and doesn't have active flows coming in, let's manually create a new application to use for our demo. So we'll do that over here, and let's call it DevOps infrastructure with some ID and DevOps for the short name, if I spelled that correctly. Okay, and for this app we'll create two different metadata objects, one to define an IDE or integrated development environment, and a second one for a programming language. So we're going to go over to insert metadata, and now in our application section we'll choose DevOps infrastructure that we just put in with our fictitious values there. And then we'll start by identifying that discoverable object, the pattern for that discoverable object. So over here on the right you see a pane, search database. This is a utility pane that allows us to test out our regexes. Now since our two metadata objects are going to be an IDE and a programming language, let's go ahead and take a look at that. So we'll go with software with names like something and look for what we have, and let's unique that result set. Okay, so Komodo is there, so we can use Komodo for the IDE, and we'll validate. Okay, there's 4 Komodos, so that's what we'll use. So matching class over here, software, attribute name, just like we had in our utility over here, add a pattern with the regular expression matching Komodo. So that's our regular expression for the discoverable object. Now let's take a look at the environment, logical group, location, and logical object. Environment, how are we going to determine which environment a related Komodo object is in? And for this, I will just cut and paste from my side window here, where I'm going to use a DNS record with name value like this for lab, and there are some sample regular expressions in here to help you out, but any Python regex will work. And I'll say OK there, and just to validate over here, we'll put it on this side so you can see that there are valid objects coming back from the lab instance. And let's add a second pattern for, we'll go with QA. OK, and again, just to validate, we're saying anything without lab in the DNS name in this instance. OK, so now our environment is set. Logical group for this Komodo, wait, we want to do IDE, and then logical object we'll call Komodo, and then the location is going to be another regex, and for this we'll use an IP address instead of DNS as we used up here in environment. So we'll use an IP address with a pattern and to validate that, so we have some, and then we'll say Chicago. Okay, so that completes our metadata. So we insert that one, and we want to do two. The second one we'll do is a programming language, so let's go back. Perl's one, but we have Python too. So let's go with Python. All right. So then down here we will change our pattern from Komodo to Python, and then change the groups and objects accordingly. So instead of IDE here, we'll use language. And down here, instead of Komodo, Python. And we'll leave the location and the environment the same, because that will be the same across most metadata objects once you identify what that is. So we'll insert this. And now we have two metadata objects in, one for our IDE and one for the programming language. So now if we go to update metadata and delete metadata, we should see our two objects here, the object that we have for the IDE right there and the object for the Python language. And you can delete those things too. Just a utility here that allows sample interaction. Now let's look at the graphical representation of the DevOps model. So we have our discoverables down here. Looks like 3 of the Python results found with our DB search came through, but only 3 of the 4 Komodos came through. That's a result of one of them not matching the metadata, which makes sense because one of them's outside what we qualified as lab or QA. But you can see the layers here, IDE, language, down to our Komodo and Python. So that's the view. Now we can take a look at the history. Now watching history on something that's brand new isn't interesting, so let's choose another one. Here's what it looks like when it's first created. No changes tracked, just the content. So let's jump down here and see some sample changes. Here's an object that was removed, and here is the data that came along with it and some context along with that. Here's a created object. Here's newly modified. So you can see change being tracked on the instance of the model. Now let's take a look at the metadata. Choose the same one here. And it's text-based, but again, this is not the consumer front end. All right. So from the definition through the history, you can see how easy it is to create a complex model with IT Discovery Machine. I walked through creating 2 metadata objects, one for the Komodo IDE and for the Python programming language. Those were descriptors for the single high-level object we call DevOps, and we viewed it over here. The metadata told the system which discoverable objects to model up to DevOps, how to model those through those middle tiers, which I showed: environment, logical group, location, and logical object. And once we did that, we were done. We saw the view and then the history, which we just walked through. The system will now continue to auto-update that for future CI changes. Thanks for watching.